I'm Takira, and thanks for joining us again for the WeConnect Wednesday video series. Last week, we discussed the importance of suspending our judgments and shifting frames of reference so that we can see in situations from different angles and be open to different interpretations. Today, we are going to talk about the importance of listening in order to connect with others. But first, let's join our friends at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute.
Here we are at Bus Ride to Freedom. If we look here at the broken glass, this signifies danger ahead. By 1961, the federal government had already deemed interstate bus segregation illegal. However, in the South, it wasn't enforced. What this meant was, as soon as buses coming from the North and Northern states passed the Mason-Dixon line, they still had to segregate. So, as soon as a bus crossed the Mason-Dixon line, they had to put up a curtain between African American and white passengers, and bus stops in the South were still segregated between black and white people. Because this was illegal, protesters in the North decided that they wanted to start the Freedom Rides, which was for them to follow a route starting in Washington, D.C. and heading all the way down to New Orleans. The Congress of Racial Equality, led by James Farmer, was the initial group to start this movement. So in the North, both black and white protesters began their bus travels in Washington, D.C. It's important that we recognize that this was a multiracial coalition of protesters. This is important because up to this point, mostly the people fighting for civil rights were only African American. The Montgomery bus boycotts, the sit-ins in the South, these were not multiracial up until this point. The reason why this is worth noting is because having white people along for the fight against racism and discrimination showed the entire country that on one side you have racists who are only white, and on the other side you have the people fighting for civil rights who are both black and white, and it shows pretty clearly which side is the one to be on. So from Washington, D.C. all the way through Atlanta, the Congress of Racial Equality, led by James Farmer, was traveling. However, in Atlanta, James Farmer's mother died, so he had to leave. In Atlanta, we have Martin Luther King Jr. meeting with the Freedom Riders and telling them, the farther you go into the South, the more dangerous it's going to be. I really recommend that you turn around. And we have people like Diane Nash, another prominent civil rights leader, telling him these bus riders in Washington, D.C. wrote their final will and testimonies. They knew what they were getting into and they were willing to fight this fight. So we will continue going, and we are aware of the danger that will follow. Picking up in Atlanta was John Lewis and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which continued the journey after James Farmer had to leave. The first major violent event that occurred was in Anniston, when a bus of Freedom Riders was stopped by the KKK and they were pulled out of the bus and the bus was burned. Luckily, no one was killed, but actually, when they were lighting the Molotov cocktails to throw it onto the bus, the KKK was trying to push the doors shut, and the state police officers had to step in and let the people out so that they wouldn't have been burned in the massive fire that followed. The Freedom Rides were far from the only important civil rights events which occurred in 1961. Here, we have federal judge Frank Johnson, who was described as Martin Luther King Jr. as the face of justice. Frank Johnson determined that discrimination was illegal in the South, setting an important precedent for the U.S. Constitution and U.S. laws to be upheld by the federal government within the South.
As a citizen in the United States, voting is very important. The 15th Amendment states, no matter your race, religion, or color, you shall not be denied the right to vote. Though this was an amendment, many states contradicted this law by using strategies such as the grandfather clause, which basically stated if you were granted the right to vote before 1867, you could continue to vote without the use of literacy tests. Literacy tests often included questions such as spell the word vote upside down but in correct order, and spell the word backwards forward. This made voting for people of color relatively difficult because the 15th Amendment was not signed until 1870, and before 1870 it was illegal for a person of color to vote. The struggle of voting led to people like Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who famously stated they can outlaw an organization but they can't outlaw a movement of a people determined to be free. He created the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights because the NAACP was banned in the state of Alabama. Here you have a picture of who became known as the Big Three: Fred Shuttlesworth, Ralph Abernathy, and Martin Luther King. This picture was taken after Fred Shuttlesworth invited Martin Luther King to come to Birmingham for the first time. Because you have three prominent leaders in the civil rights movement coming together, Birmingham, the world is watching.
Out of the Big Three, they create Project C for confrontation. Project C is a joint operation between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. This organization is the backing of many marches, protesters, and sit-ins in Birmingham. Now, this organization at first wanted to have a parade permit to do this the legal way. So when Bull Connor denies their permit, they still go out and march. This march right here is called the Good Friday March. This Good Friday March was when Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, and Dr. Martin Luther King all got arrested. Ralph Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth were released on bail, while Dr. King, he stayed in jail without bail for 11 days.
Gaining the skills to listen and thoughtfully get to know another person of a background different from your own is important. One of the best ways to get to know someone is through listening to someone else's life experiences. Being a good listener doesn't always come naturally. It can take practice. Here are some ways you can practice listening in order to connect with others. First, try to quiet your own mind and really listen to the other person without always thinking about what you are going to say next. It's also good to let the speaker know that they are being heard. You can do this by nodding, gesturing, or making eye contact. When you are having a conversation, try to listen to understand from the viewpoint of the speaker. Ask yourself, what is this person trying to communicate to me? And finally, listen closely to find something new to learn about the speaker. Even if you are already a great listener, it can still be hard starting a conversation with someone new. You can get the ball rolling by asking simple questions like, what do you like to do for fun? Tell me about your favorite person. Or, what do you like the most in the world? During the next week, practice listening with your family and friends. Or, if you have the opportunity, start a conversation with someone you have never met or don't know much about. You might just make a new friend. Do you know any interesting conversation starters or listening tips? Share with us in the comments. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.